Sarah Whitcomb didn't know that the pickup truck, rolling slowly down her gravel driveway that morning, would force her in less than 30 days to choose between signing away everything she owned, watching her children lose their future, or standing alone against the richest man in 3 counties. Her hands were raw from bleach and cold water, elbow deep in a laundry basin she wasn't paid enough for, when the crunch of tires on gravel made her freeze. It wasn't the first time that week that truck had rolled past her fence line, slow, deliberate, like a man taking inventory of something he already considered his. A few yards away, under the shade of an old pecan tree, 2 6-month-old babies slept tangled together on a quilt, completely unaware that their mother was carrying the weight of an entire household and a future that got a little more uncertain every single week that passed. If you've ever known a woman raising her kids completely alone, with no one to lean on, don't go anywhere yet, because that's exactly what this story is about. Hit like, subscribe to Second Chance Tales, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one, because we've got so many more stories like this coming. And tell us in the comments if you're one of those mums who raised her babies solo. We'd love to hear your story, and let us know what town is watching with us tonight. Now let's go back 3 months to a small ranching town in the Texas Hill Country called Cedar Creek, because that truck creeping down the road was about to change everything. Cedar Creek was the kind of town you only found if you already knew it existed, tucked between 2 limestone ridges that turned a deep, aching green after the spring rains and faded to the color of old leather every summer. It had one paved main street, a feed store, a diner that had been serving the same coffee since 1978, and a small county courthouse that handled everything from marriage licenses to land disputes. Sarah had grown up here, the daughter of a long-haul trucker named Robert Whitcomb, who spent half his life on the road hauling freight between Texas and Oklahoma, and a mother, Diane, who was widowed young and raised Sarah on her own, teaching her to can vegetables, patch fences, and never, under any circumstances, let anyone see her break. From her mother, Sarah inherited honey-colored eyes and the habit of looking people straight in the face, which made some of the men around town uncomfortable because they were used to widows keeping their eyes on the ground. Robert died when Sarah was 12, killed when his rig jackknifed on an icy overpass he'd driven 1,000 times before. After that, Diane took in sewing and sold eggs at the Saturday farmers market to keep the lights on, and she never once complained in front of her daughter. Sarah learned the hardest lesson of her life from that woman, that pain can be carried in silence without ever stopping being real. Sarah met Daniel Coleman at the Founders Day Festival, the biggest event of the year in Cedar Creek, when she was 19 and he was 23. Daniel worked as the most trusted ranch hand at Halloway Cattle Company, a sprawling operation owned by Richard Halloway, the wealthiest man for 3 counties in any direction. Daniel had an easy laugh and hands rough enough to throw a lasso but gentle enough to hold a newborn. That night the local band played until midnight, fireworks cracked over the square, and the air smelled like gunpowder and kettle corn. Daniel walked up to Sarah with a clumsy honesty that struck her as more real than any smooth line she'd heard before, and asked, hat in hand, if she'd give him a dance. They danced exactly once that night, but it was enough for both of them to understand something their heads hadn't caught up to yet. They dated for 8 months, Sunday afternoon visits and awkward handwritten letters, and Diane, watching how seriously Daniel treated her daughter, gave her blessing on one condition, that he promised never to let Sarah go through the same hardship she had as a young widow. Daniel promised with his hand over his heart, and he kept that promise with everything he had for as long as fate allowed him to. They married 8 months later at the Cedar Creek Community Chapel and moved into a small farmhouse on 5 acres that had belonged to Sarah's family for 2 generations, a modest piece of land, but theirs, with a natural spring at the back edge of the property that never ran dry, not even in the worst drought years. Neither of them knew yet that this spring was the exact reason their whole story was about to take a violent turn. Diane passed 2 years after the wedding, from a fever no small-town clinic could bring down in time, and she went knowing her daughter was well married and had a roof of her own. Sarah inherited her mother's cedar rosary box and the habit of saying a quiet prayer before bed. Nothing formal, just a few remembered words, more like talking to an old friend than reciting something memorized. The spring on the Whitcomb land had been known in the county for 3 generations. It never dried up, not even in the worst summer anyone could remember, and its overflow fed not only Sarah's 5 acres, but ran downhill into a stretch of pasture land that bordered Halloway Cattle Company's northern range. Richard Halloway had wanted that water for years, to expand his herd without depending on Cedar Creek itself, which ran thin and sometimes vanished completely during dry spells. But Sarah didn't know any of that yet. The morning Daniel walked out the door with a coil of rope over his shoulder to help round up cattle that had panicked during a storm and crossed a rain-swollen ravine. It was a grey morning in early June, the sky still heavy with black clouds, the creek roaring below like something alive. When Daniel and 2 other ranch hands rode out, trucks couldn't make it through that terrain, to pull 6 head of cattle trapped in a bend of the ravine, surrounded by water rising faster than anyone had accounted for. The other 2 men got the animals out on the safe side, but Daniel saw a newborn calf going under in the current and waded in without a second thought, the way a man does when he's already decided, without saying it out loud, that a helpless animal's life is worth the risk to his own. He reached the calf, shoved it toward the bank with the last of his strength, but the current, which had been patiently waiting its turn, swept him under in the same instant he let the animal go. The other 2 men arrived at the farmhouse that same afternoon, soaked to the bone, faces grey, barely needing to say a word, because their expressions told the whole story already. They'd searched the creek downstream until darkness stopped them and returned at first light with more men from town, including the county sheriff, Walt Briggs, who insisted on joining the search even though nobody asked him to. They found Daniel's body 2 days later, tangled in the roots of a cypress tree more than a mile from where the current had taken him. Sarah got the news standing in her kitchen doorway, the newborn twins barely 3 weeks old, 1 in each arm, and she didn't scream and she didn't collapse. She went still the way someone goes still when they've taken a bullet they don't know yet has killed them. Her neighbor, Carol Jennings, who happened to be visiting that morning to help with the babies, covered her mouth with both hands and started praying under her breath without anyone asking her to. The funeral was small, held under a light drizzle that felt like the sky itself was grieving. Sarah carried the twins wrapped together in 1 blanket through the entire service, unable to put them down for even a moment, as if holding them was the only thing keeping her upright. Sheriff Briggs, a broad, quiet man who'd known Daniel since grade school, put a hand on her shoulder afterward and told her that losing a good man was, in some strange way, proof that he'd been loved for real, and that love didn't go into the ground with him. It stayed alive in the 2 children in her arms. Sarah couldn't find the words to answer, but she kept that sentence and came back to it more than once on the darkest nights that followed. Richard Halloway showed up at the funeral in an impeccable black suit that cost more than most people in Cedar Creek made in a month. He gave his condolences in a voice that struck Sarah, even through her grief, as strangely rehearsed, and before he left, he squeezed her hand and told her to count on him for anything she needed, that Daniel had been his best man, and a man like that shouldn't leave his family stranded. He left minutes later, before the first shovel of dirt even hit the casket, leaving behind a cloud of expensive cologne that felt, without Sarah understanding why yet, deeply out of place next to so much genuine grief. Sarah didn't realize then that those soft words, spoken with a compassionate look and a gentle voice, were the first stone in a path Richard Halloway had been paving for years with other widows across the county. A road built on fake kindness that always ended in the same place, the widow's land quietly changing hands into his. The months that followed were the hardest Sarah had ever lived through. She discovered that despite barely eating enough herself, her body still gave the twins everything they needed, and she thanked God for that every single night with a short, plain prayer her mother had taught her. The kind of words a person keeps folded up inside their chest and pulls out when they've got nothing else left. She discovered, too, that Carol Jennings, the retired midwife who'd delivered both twins, showed up once a week with a bag of groceries and news from town that Sarah only half listened to while scrubbing other people's laundry in a plastic tub in her backyard, because taking in wash was the only work that let her stay close to her babies. It didn't pay much, barely enough for groceries, but it was something. And in those months, she learned that a woman's dignity isn't measured by what's on the table, but by how straight she holds her head even when the table is nearly bare. There was one night, when the twins were barely 2 months old, when little Lucy woke up burning with fever and Sarah, with no money for the emergency clinic in the next town, walked nearly 2 miles in the dark, carrying her daughter pressed to her chest, praying under her breath the whole way, terrified of losing this child too after already losing so much. Carol brought the fever down with cool cloths and bitter tea, and stayed up with Sarah until sunrise, when little Lucy finally opened her eyes and rooted hungrily at her mother's chest. Sarah cried then, harder than she had even at the funeral, and that morning she learned that some tears you save for after the danger is past, because in the moment itself there's no time or strength left to shed them. At night, once the twins were finally down, Sarah would sit on the porch with a mug of weak coffee and look at the old rocking chair where Daniel used to mend tack before heading out to work. She'd take out her mother's cedar rosary and turn the beads between her fingers without quite praying, more like someone looking for company than someone asking for something specific, letting the quiet of the hill country hand back a little of the peace the day had stolen from her. Sometimes she talked out loud, like Daniel could hear her from wherever he was, telling him how the babies had grown that week, what new sound Wyatt had almost managed to say, how much little Lucy was starting to look like her at that age. It was on a Thursday, exactly 3 months after the funeral, that Richard Halloway started showing up more often than politeness required. The first time he came with a truck bed full of feed, which he said was a gift, no strings attached, in Daniel's memory. He stayed a while chatting from the porch, telling stories about Daniel's ranch days with a warmth that seemed sincere, even got Sarah to laugh for the first time since the burial with a story about a bull that got loose during somebody's wedding. Sarah hesitated to accept the feed, but the thought of her children weighed more than the suspicion already creeping in. The second visit came with news that he'd talked to the county tax office and arranged for her property tax to be deferred another year, as a special favor to the widow of a man he'd respected so much. He brought her a new coat that visit too, and 2 knit caps for the twins, gifts that looked on the surface like pure generosity, but that Sarah, without quite being able to explain why, buried at the bottom of a trunk and never used. The third visit came with a comment that planted the first seed of what was coming. Richard mentioned almost offhand that a woman alone with 2 babies didn't have many respectable options in a town this small, and that he, if she ever needed it, knew more than one good man willing to consider an advantageous arrangement for both parties. Sarah changed the subject with a skill she didn't know she had, and that night before falling asleep, she felt for the first time, clear as day, that inner voice, the same one that had warned her as a child when a dog was about to bite, telling her that no favor from Richard Halloway ever came without interest attached that she couldn't fully see yet. It was that same October, when the twins turned 6 months old, that the sound of a different engine broke the silence of the Whitcomb driveway for the first time, one that brought no sacks of feed and no rehearsed smiles, just the tired hum of a man who'd been driving for hours. Jack Bennett was 33 years old and had a way of looking at the world like he was always searching for something he'd already stopped expecting to find. He owned the Bennett family spread on the far side of Miller's Ridge, a mid-sized cattle operation inherited from his father and held together through 8 years of stubborn, relentless work. He wasn't a man the town fully understood, because despite his age and his solid standing, he hadn't so much as looked twice at another woman since he was widowed 7 years earlier, in a way the whole town still remembered with the quiet respect reserved for real tragedy. His wife, Laura, had been the daughter of a schoolteacher from a nearby town, a woman with a bright laugh and gentle hands that had never touched a fence post before she met Jack, but who'd learned the ranch work gladly just to be near him. They'd been married barely 2 years before the tragedy, and those 2 years, Jack would admit on his most honest nights, had been the only time in his adult life the big farmhouse on Miller's Ridge had felt like it made any sense at all, like the empty rooms and the wide front porch weren't just wasted space, but a promise of a family still coming. Laura died in childbirth along with the baby she was carrying, a girl they'd already planned to name Grace. The baby never took a single breath outside her mother's body. Jack had been there that night, waiting in the hallway, while the town's midwife, called in from 2 counties over, did everything she possibly could inside the bedroom. He'd heard Laura's cries of pain for hours. He'd prayed like he'd never prayed before, on his knees in that hallway, hands clenched so tight his knuckles went white, begging a God he'd only ever half believed in to take anything except those two lives. He'd promised, in that desperate prayer, that he'd give up anything else life had planned for him if only those two could stay. And yet fate, or bad luck, or whatever it is that sometimes falls on a house without explanation, took them both within minutes of each other that same night. Jack carried his daughter's small body wrapped in a white cloth, and didn't know in that moment whether the God he'd prayed to all night actually existed, or whether the world just ran on its own with no one steering it at all. He buried them together, mother and daughter, in the Cedar Creek Cemetery. Under an oak tree he planted himself over the grave afterward, and from then on he avoided that stretch of the cemetery except on Memorial Day, when he brought flowers in silence and stayed only a few minutes, unable to stay longer without his chest closing up on him. From then on, Jack shut a part of himself away and never opened it again, convinced love was a bet he'd already lost once and didn't have the nerve to play twice. His mother, still alive in those years, told him more than once to find company again, that there was no shame in wanting to love someone else. But Jack always gave her the same answer, that he preferred the familiar silence to the chance of a second loss just as big. When his mother passed too, 5 years after Laura, Jack was completely alone in that big farmhouse, and that's when work became his only way of talking to the world. He threw himself into the ranch with an intensity the town mistook for ambition, but that was really just the only way Jack knew to fill the hours without thinking too hard. He traveled often, buying and selling cattle at auctions across the state, and it was on exactly one of those trips, taking a shortcut on his way to the county seat, that his truck hit a stretch of washed-out gravel road, and he found himself pulling up in front of a small farmhouse where a young woman was scrubbing clothes in a plastic tub, 2 babies asleep in the shade of a pecan tree nearby. He couldn't explain afterward why he'd stopped. His truck did need gas, that part was true, but it didn't explain why he sat there a beat longer than courtesy allowed, just watching. He cut the engine, got out slow, and walked up to a respectful distance, taking off his cap before he spoke. He apologized for the intrusion and asked if she could spare a glass of water. Sarah sized him up with the look she'd learned to use on every stranger since Daniel's death, but found nothing in him that read as danger, so she went and got the water and handed it to him from a careful distance. Jack drank it slow, thanked her sincerely, and before he left his eyes went, without asking permission, toward the pecan tree where the twins were sleeping. He asked, in a voice Sarah found strangely careful, if those two were hers. She said yes, that they were Wyatt and Lucy, 6 months old. Jack nodded slowly. He stood quiet a moment, like a man remembering something he'd rather not say out loud. Then he said goodbye with more respect than Sarah had gotten from any man since her husband's funeral. He drove off but didn't get far. A little over a mile down the road, he pulled the truck over under a lone oak, cut the engine, ran a hand through his hair, and sat staring at the horizon with a restlessness he couldn't quite name. There was something about that woman's steadiness, the way she'd held out that glass without dropping her eyes, the exhaustion written on a face that still didn't ask for pity, that had stirred something in him he thought he'd buried 7 years ago. He didn't go straight home. He stopped instead at the county records office, where the clerk, a man named Feliciano Ortiz, no, we'll call him Frank Ortiz, also handled small legal filings for folks who couldn't afford a full attorney. He asked, trying to sound casual, if Frank knew anything about the woman living near the old Whitcomb Spring. Frank, a man with a long memory, told him that was Sarah, widow of Daniel Coleman, the ranch hand who'd drowned trying to save a calf a few months back. He mentioned, too, lowering his voice, that Richard Halloway had started visiting her regularly, loaded down with gifts, and that folks around town were already whispering the billionaire had his eye on the widow's land, because that property held the only spring in the whole county that never ran dry. And a man like Richard Halloway didn't hand out feed sacks without expecting to collect later, with interest. Jack listened with a growing unease that wasn't just curiosity anymore. He asked if Richard had pulled something like this before with other widows. Frank, after a pause, admitted he had. At least 2 other women who'd ended up losing their land shortly after being widowed, always over some debt that surfaced out of nowhere right when there was no husband left to argue against it. He didn't say more because even the most honest county clerk knows that talking too much about the most powerful man in 3 counties has a way of costing you. Jack spent that night at Miss Peggy's boarding house in town, a woman known for being the biggest gossip and the biggest heart in Cedar Creek, who served him a plate of chili and asked, with the kind of familiarity small towns allow, what had him so deep in thought. Jack didn't answer right away. He thought about Laura, about the emptiness her absence had left, about the 7 years he'd spent convinced there was no more room in his life to feel something that strong again. He thought about Sarah, too, about her raw hands in that laundry tub, about the steadiness in the way she'd held out that glass, asking for nothing back. And that night, before falling asleep, he did something he hadn't done in 7 years. He prayed, not asking to get back what he'd lost, but asking with a new kind of humility for the courage not to let fear make his decisions for him anymore. 3 days later, he drove back down Sarah's road with the excuse of having left his canteen behind, a lie so thin he barely believed it himself, but Sarah accepted it without pushing, even with suspicion still bright in her eyes. This time, after drinking the water, Jack noticed the loose shingles on her roof and mentioned the next storm was going to find that house wide open if nobody fixed them. Sarah answered flatly that she'd get to it when she could, and Jack understood, looking at her cracked hands and the crate where the twins slept, that this woman would never ask for help even if the roof came down on top of her and the whole family with it. So he said, calm and easy, that he had the afternoon free and it wouldn't cost him a thing to climb up and fix those shingles, that he wouldn't take a dime for it, that he just wanted to sleep easy, knowing a house with 2 babies in it wasn't going to be wide open to the sky come the next hard rain. Sarah hesitated, looked at the children, looked at the heavy clouds already gathering over the ridge, and understood that pride is sometimes a luxury a single mother can't afford. She nodded just barely, and Jack worked over an hour in the sun without complaint or a single word of payment asked. Over the following weeks, Jack kept showing up, always with a different excuse. Once to fix a sagging section of fence, another time to drop off a sack of feed he claimed was about to go bad, another time carrying 2 simple wooden toys he'd carved himself at night, a little horse and a little truck, thinking of the twins without quite being able to explain why. Sarah accepted it all with a guarded expression and a quick thank you, but something was starting to move inside her that she wasn't ready to name yet. There was one particular afternoon Sarah would remember for years. One of those storms only the hill country knows how to throw together came down without warning while she was hanging laundry, and the wind nearly tipped the twins' crate right out from under the pecan tree. Jack, who happened to be passing by on his way into town, jumped out of his truck without thinking twice and ran to shield the babies with his own jacket before the rain reached them, carrying them onto the porch while Sarah scrambled to grab the laundry. The 3 of them ended up crowded together under the porch roof, the twins wide awake now and startled by the thunder, watching sheets of rain pour down across the yard. And in that moment, without either of them saying a word, something settled between them that there was no taking back. Jack stayed until the storm passed. He helped Sarah get the wood stove going to warm up some food, and before he left that night, he told her that if she ever needed anything urgent, even in the middle of the night, not to hesitate to send word out to the Bennett place. Jack never overstepped, never said a word out of line, never looked at her in any way that made her uncomfortable. He'd stay outside, work on whatever needed fixing, take the coffee when she insisted on offering it, and leave. But their eyes always found their way back to that crate where the twins slept. And sometimes Sarah caught him looking at Wyatt with an expression she couldn't name then, though in time she'd understand it was the look of a man slowly making peace with a wound he'd carried unhealed for 7 years. One afternoon, while Jack sat carving a 3rd little figure, this time a dog, Sarah worked up the nerve to ask him why he'd never remarried, being a man of good standing and still young. Jack went quiet a long moment, looking at the knife in his hands, and answered only that he'd had a wife once, and that since she'd gone he hadn't found a reason good enough to try again. Until recently. He didn't say more, and Sarah didn't ask more. But that afternoon they both understood without saying it that something between them had started growing with the same patience as a crop nobody rushes. Cedar Creek, like every small town, started talking. Miss Peggy, who besides running the boarding house had the sharpest eyes and the loosest tongue in the whole county, was the first to notice that the reclusive rancher from Miller's Ridge kept turning up an awful lot on the road out to the widow Coleman's place. She mentioned it first at the feed store, then to 2 women buying soap that morning, and the news made it around Cedar Creek in under a week, picking up details nobody had actually seen, the way gossip does in fertile soil. People said Jack was spending whole nights at the widow's house, that she'd taken up with him before her year of mourning was even over, that no decent woman entertained a man alone without a chaperone. None of it was true, but the truth in a small town rarely travels as fast as the lie. Sarah started feeling the stares that Sunday at the grocery store, carrying the twins in her arms, noticing the whispers behind her at the checkout line. 2 women who used to greet her warmly crossed the aisle to avoid her. A third, a distant cousin of Daniel's, said under her breath, pretending to be friendly, "How quickly a widow forgets the dead once a man with a ranch shows up." Sarah felt the blood rush to her face but didn't answer. She kept her back straight, because she'd learned early that whoever bows their head to gossip only makes the gossip grow louder. But the real danger wasn't the town's gossip. It was Richard Halloway's reaction once the news reached him. The billionaire, who'd been building his plan for years with patient calculation, felt his timeline collapsing faster than he'd planned for. He wasn't a man who lost what he already considered his by right of waiting, and certainly not to some small-time rancher like Jack Bennett. He decided to speed up the play he'd been preparing for months. He showed up at Sarah's place on a Thursday morning without Jack around, riding in his black Cadillac truck with his foreman Wade Briggs, a hard-eyed man of few words, riding shotgun. Richard stepped out with that fake courtesy Sarah was starting to recognize, took off his hat and said he needed to talk about a delicate matter that couldn't wait any longer. He said in a gentle voice that he'd found among the ranch's old paperwork a document showing Daniel had taken out a substantial loan months before the wedding to buy the land Sarah now lived on. Land that, according to that yellowed paper he pulled from his jacket pocket, had never actually been fully owned by the Whitcomb family free and clear, but had been mortgaged before that to Halloway Cattle Company. Sarah felt the ground open under her bare feet. Daniel had never mentioned any debt, and she'd known her husband well enough to know he'd never have put their only piece of land on the line without telling her. She remembered clearly, too, the last weeks before Daniel's death, when he'd proudly told her he was saving up a little money hidden in a coffee can, exactly to buy a milk cow as soon as he could. A man who saved every dollar wasn't a man who'd borrowed a fortune months earlier without a word. She tried to argue, said she wanted to see the paperwork with a lawyer present, that she wanted to talk to Carol and to Sheriff Briggs first, but Richard, with the crooked smile of a man who already knows he's winning, said he was terribly sorry for the widow's grief. But paperwork doesn't lie, and if the debt wasn't settled in 30 days, the company would be forced to take possession of the property, spring and all. Before he left, lowering his voice like a man sharing friendly advice, he added that maybe the smartest move for a woman alone would be to consider a different arrangement altogether. His nephew, Preston Halloway, also a widower and well-established, had been struck by her at church last Sunday, and would be willing to marry her and solve in one stroke both the debt and the loneliness of a mother with 2 babies. He said he'd speak to Preston that very week if she gave her consent, and that a quick wedding would be enough to make the whole matter of the debt disappear, like wiping a chalkboard clean. Sarah felt disgust rise in her throat like bile, but held it back, understanding that showing too much contempt in that moment could cost her dearly. She answered in the steadiest voice she could manage that she needed time to think it over, that her husband's memory deserved at least that much respect. Richard nodded, satisfied, like a man who already considers the deal done, and said to think it over, that out of respect for Daniel's memory, he'd give her those 30 days, though not 1 day more. Before mounting back into his truck, Wade Briggs, who'd stood silent by the fence the whole time, lingered a long moment looking at the pecan tree where the twins slept, a gesture that needed no words to make it clear the company's patience had a very calculated limit. Sarah understood in that moment that everything, the sacks of feed, the deferred taxes, the visits loaded with fake kindness, had only ever been the first steps of a trap patiently built over years. She went inside, sat on the bench, pressed her grandmother's rosary to her chest, and let one single tear fall before wiping it away and forcing herself to think clearly. 30 days wasn't much time, but it was enough, and she had, though she didn't fully realize it yet, more allies than Richard Halloway could ever have imagined. 2 days after Richard's visit, while Sarah hung laundry on the line. A second truck pulled up the drive. This man, dressed sharper than was common around these parts, was Preston Halloway, the nephew. A man in his 40s with a neat moustache and city manners that didn't quite match the dust of the road. He got out with an exaggerated politeness, introduced himself as if Sarah didn't already know exactly who he was, and said, with a smile meant to be charming, that his uncle had explained the situation, and that he, as a man of honor, wanted to offer her personally the chance to settle everything in the most dignified way possible for both of them. He talked about the house he kept in the county seat, about staff who could look after the children while she was out, about financial security she'd never have to worry about again. Sarah listened standing, arms crossed over her chest, not inviting him to sit, as if shielding herself from a cold that wasn't actually in the air that afternoon. When Preston finished his pitch, she answered with a calm that cost her everything she had left to gather, saying she appreciated the consideration, but had no intention of marrying again so soon, let alone through an arrangement between families that didn't even know her. Preston pushed, his tone shifting harder, reminding her the debt was still there, that the 30 days weren't waiting on anybody, and that turning down such a reasonable solution could look like the foolishness of a woman who hadn't thought through the consequences for her own children. Sarah felt her blood boil, but kept her voice low when she told him that her children were exactly the reason. She wasn't going to let anyone pressure her into anything, and that if the debt was legitimate, she'd fight it through the proper channels, and if it wasn't, as she suspected, no man was going to buy her silence with a house in the county seat. Preston rode off with his jaw tight, muttering something about what his uncle would think of that answer, leaving Sarah with her legs shaking from held-back rage, but also with a new certainty. Those people weren't going to give up easily, and she needed more than ever someone on her side who knew how to move through the world of paperwork and courtrooms. Jack showed up that same afternoon with some fresh milk, and noticed right away from the tension in Sarah's shoulders at the stove that something was wrong. She told him everything, no tears, no theatrics, in the same flat voice you'd use to describe the weather. Jack felt his jaw tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. He asked the exact amount of the supposed debt, and the second Sarah told him, he understood the scheme. It was an impossible sum for a ranch hand's modest wages, with no collateral to back it. He offered to pay it off himself in one lump sum, but Sarah refused just as firmly as always, saying she wasn't going to start a new life owing that kind of favor to a man she barely knew. Jack understood that pride, because it was the same pride he'd carried inside himself since he was a boy, and he didn't push. But he asked permission to drive to the county seat and find out whether that document had any legal record at all. That night, he knocked on Frank Ortiz's door, and the notary, seeing the seriousness on Jack's face, invited him in without hesitation. Jack laid out the whole story, and Frank, after listening in silence, admitted he'd suspected for a while that Richard Halloway was taking advantage of widows in the area to strip them of their land, though he'd never been able to prove it. He said he'd known Daniel since he was a boy, that Daniel was a man who never owed anybody anything, and that he'd help Jack however he could. The next morning, Jack drove 3 hours to the county records office, cutting through back roads still wet from the night's rain, the air smelling like damp earth. He found Frank already waiting, glasses on, 3 thick leather-bound ledgers pulled from a filing cabinet, flipping through page after page, wetting his thumb every so often to turn the sheet. Jack waited in the corner of the office, drinking coffee that went cold without him noticing, watching the ordinary business of the town carry on outside the window, completely unaware of the storm gathering just down the road. It took Frank several hours, and when he came back, his face already said everything before he spoke. There was no record anywhere of any loan to Daniel Coleman. Not for that amount, not for any amount. But that wasn't all. He'd found 2 other similar documents, both involving widows in the county, both claiming phantom debts their husbands had supposedly left behind, both with the same tight handwriting and the same worn stamp Jack immediately recognized as Halloway Cattle Company's. One of those women had already handed over her land out of desperation and moved to the city to live with her sister. The other, Frank said, lowering his voice, still lived in the area, but had rushed into marrying a foreman recommended by Richard himself just weeks after losing her husband, a marriage that never quite sat right with anybody in town. Jack felt a mix of fury and second-hand shame twist his stomach, because he understood that Sarah wasn't the first, and that if nobody stepped in, she wasn't going to be the last either. He thanked Frank, left a little cash on the counter despite the notary's initial refusal, and drove home with his blood boiling in his chest. On the way back, he pulled over under a huge live oak, one of those ancient trees folks around the hill country say have outlived more generations than any man, and sat on a thick root with the proof folded in his pocket, thinking about what it meant to publicly go up against the most powerful man in the county. And if he was wrong, he thought, and because of the fight he'd chosen to pick, Richard did something worse to Sarah and the children before a judge or the sheriff could step in. For the first time since he'd started helping this woman, Jack felt real fear, not for himself, but for her. He thought about giving up, about going home, about handing the proof over to Sheriff Briggs and letting the county pay the invented debt quietly to end it without confrontation, even if it meant losing money, and in appearance at least, letting the wrong man win. That was the safe way out, the one that protected Sarah's body from any retaliation. He sat there a long while, weighing both paths like a man holding 2 sacks of feed, one in each hand, trying to guess which one weighed more without setting either down. But then he remembered Sarah's face that first day, standing firm in her doorway, handing him the glass from a distance, never dropping her eyes. He remembered her raw hands in that laundry tub. He remembered the twins asleep in that wooden crate their father had built before he died, and he understood something simple. Quietly paying off the debt protected Sarah's body, but it insulted her spirit. A woman with that kind of backbone was never going to accept getting her home back, through a silent favor she couldn't refuse later. She was going to want the truth out in the open, whatever it cost. He said a quiet thank you toward the sky, already turning orange over the ridgeline, and drove back with his mind made up, no doubt left in him about what he was going to do. Meanwhile, that same afternoon, Wade Briggs showed up alone at Sarah's place with orders to remind her of the deadline, and to warn her, in that low voice of a man who doesn't need to raise it to threaten, that talking to outsiders only made things worse. He looked long at the twins asleep in their crate and said little ones were delicate things, that accidents happened. Sarah felt fear crawl up her spine, but her voice didn't shake when she told him to get off her property right that second. Wade laughed low, spat on the ground and left, not before reminding her that 30 days passed faster than she thought. That night Sarah kept a kitchen knife tucked under the porch bench, barred the door with a beam she never normally used, and prayed, not just for the strength to endure anymore, but for real protection for her children, with the plain, unadorned fear of someone who has nothing left to hold on to but that. Jack arrived at nightfall, and seeing Sarah sitting on the porch with the knife close by and the look of someone who'd been through something serious, he didn't need to ask. She told him about Wade, and Jack felt a clean kind of rage that, for a moment, even scared him. He told her everything he'd found in the county records, and Sarah listened with her heart tightening at every word, finally understanding the full size of what they were up against. Jack said that the next day he'd go straight into town to confront Richard Halloway in public, with the proof in hand, then find a lawyer and file a formal complaint with the county. Sarah then asked a question Jack wasn't expecting. She asked him why he was doing all this, why a man who could be minding his own life would risk enemies, money, even his own safety for a widow he barely knew, and 2 babies who weren't his. Jack sat quiet a long moment, looking at the ground, searching for words he'd never had to say out loud before. Then he looked up and told her for the first time in front of anyone other than his own reflection about Laura, about the daughter who never got the chance to be born, about the 7 years he'd spent convinced love was a bet he'd already lost and wasn't going to play again. He said that afternoon he'd stopped to ask for water he didn't really need. Something inside him had understood that God, or life, or whatever a person wanted to call it, still had a second chance waiting for him, and that letting this woman and these children get swallowed up by a man like Richard Halloway's greed was something he'd never be able to forgive himself for. Sarah felt something shift in her chest in a way she hadn't felt in a long, long time. And though she didn't find words to answer right away, she touched his arm with a short, clumsy gesture, like someone saying thank you without knowing how. Jack felt that touch light something up inside him like a match to a candle. Before heading into town to sleep near the sheriff's office in case anything happened before morning, he touched the pistol he always carried on long trips and asked Sarah not to open the door to anyone except Carol or Sheriff Briggs. While Jack stayed in town, Richard got word that a man had been asking questions at the county records office, and by the description, it could only be the rancher who kept circling Sarah's road. He didn't say a word when he heard it. He finished his cigarette, stared at his ceiling a long while, and then called 4 of his toughest hired men, giving the order, in a low, final voice, to be at the widow's place before sunrise to remove her. No more discussion needed. Jack woke before dawn with that tightness in his chest. A countryman learns to respect because he knows it's a warning. He dressed in the dark, fired up his truck under the last star of the morning, and before hitting the road, stopped by Sheriff Briggs's house to ask him to follow as soon as he could, because he might need a witness the county would trust. In that same instant, Jack pulled onto the road. Richard's 4 men were already stepping out of their trucks in front of Sarah's house. She heard them arrive with that light sleep every mother of small children learns to keep. She got up immediately, grabbed the knife and planted herself in the doorway before the men could cross the fence line. The morning was dark blue, that hill country cold that cuts to the bone before sunrise. The oldest of the men, a scar running across his chin, said they had orders to remove her and the children that same morning, and that if she cooperated, nobody had to get hurt. Sarah answered in the steadiest voice fear allowed her to find, that this land had belonged to her husband and her family before anybody else, that she wasn't leaving without a legitimate court order, and that the first man to set foot in that yard would have to go through the knife first. It was right then that the sound of an engine cut through the dawn, and Jack's truck came around the bend, tires skidding on the gravel as he threw it into park and jumped out before it had even fully stopped, planting himself between Sarah and the 4 men, one hand steady on the pistol at his hip. The scarred man didn't back down at first, took a step forward and said this wasn't Jack's business. Jack answered without moving his hand off the gun, that a widow and her children's business was every decent man's business, and that if any one of them took one more step toward that fence, he'd find out firsthand what lead felt like at sunrise. The tension got so thick even the wind seemed to hold still in the mesquite branches. The men's trucks idled behind them, engines rumbling low, nobody moving. One of the men, more hot-headed than the rest, thought he could settle it with one push, and shoved past the scarred man, trying to muscle Jack aside toward the fence. Jack took the hit, stumbled 2 steps, but didn't go down, and before the man could recover, Jack sent him sprawling in the dirt with one clean shove. Inside the house, the noise woke Wyatt, who started crying hard, and little Lucy right behind him because small children feel their mother's fear like it's their own. Sarah shouted back that everything was fine, but she didn't lower the knife and didn't take her eyes off the men, and the twins' crying filled the morning air with a truth none of the men standing there could ignore anymore. They were here to drag a mother and 2 infants out of her own house, and that crying was living proof there was nothing decent about it. 2 of the 4 men dropped their eyes, uncomfortable, because even the toughest hired hand has some scrap of conscience that wakes up at the wrong moment. The scarred man, though, pulled a long knife and said he'd finish this before sunup. Jack drew his pistol without firing and cocked it with a click that froze the other 3 in place. That's when another vehicle came around the bend, Sheriff Walt Briggs's patrol truck, lights already flashing. He pulled up next to Jack's truck, stepped out slow and deliberate, looked each of the 4 men over one by one, and said, in the same calm voice he used breaking up bar fights on Saturday nights, that this house was now under the protection of the Cedar Creek Sheriff's Department, and that, if one hair on that mother's head or those children's heads got hurt because of them, every one of them would be named, charged, and standing in front of a judge by the end of the week. In a town this size, the word of the sheriff carries weight no outsider with money could ever buy. The 4 men lowered their heads, climbed back into their trucks and pulled away toward the Halloway ranch without another word. Jack only holstered the gun once the trucks disappeared around the bend, and only then did his legs remind him they'd been shaking the whole time. Sarah appeared in the doorway with the twins in her arms, and seeing the men gone, her own legs gave out, and she had to grab the doorframe to stay upright. Sheriff Briggs took Wyatt in his arms, with the gentleness of a man who knows how to hold something small and fragile, and told Sarah quietly that he'd be filing a full report that morning, and that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Not until Richard Halloway answered for every widow he'd done this to. Jack stood on the porch catching his breath, looking at the little farmhouse, the line of laundry still hanging, and made a decision that had been forming inside him for weeks without him quite daring to face it head-on. When the sheriff drove off to file his report, Jack asked Sarah for a moment alone. He sat beside her on the bench, not too close, giving her space, and after a long silence searching for the right words, he took off his cap and told her that he'd spent 33 years believing he had his whole life ahead of him to figure out what mattered. And that morning, watching 4 men ready to drag a mother and her babies out of their own home, he'd understood that a whole life is just a loan nobody knows when they'll have to pay back. He said he wasn't asking for her hand out of pity or convenience, because that would be an insult to a woman like her, but because from the very first day he'd seen her hold out that glass of water without dropping her eyes, something in his empty life had started filling back up, something he'd given up on 7 years ago for good. He said, too, without waiting for an answer, that no matter what she decided, he was going to settle the matter of that fake debt and the land, because real protection, he said, isn't the kind that depends on one man's goodwill. It's the kind that's signed in front of a judge, where nobody can ever take it away again. Sarah sat quiet a long while with Wyatt asleep in her arms, and tears started rolling down her face without her trying to stop them, not from fear, not from grief, but from that strange feeling of being chosen by someone. After months of feeling like nothing but a burden, the world kept shoving from one place to the next. She told him she needed time to think it over calmly, that she didn't want to answer in the heat of that morning's fear, but that she felt something for him too that no longer fit quietly inside her, and that if he was willing to wait a little while, the answer was probably going to be the one he was hoping for. Jack felt his chest open in a way he'd never experienced in his entire adult life, and for the first time in years, he gave thanks out loud, looking up at a sky already turning a warm orange over the ridge. That same morning, with the sun well up and the whole town awake, Jack drove into the county seat with Sheriff Briggs and found Richard Halloway right there at the diner, having coffee with 2 rancher friends, Wade Briggs standing behind him as always, still unaware of what had happened that dawn. Jack walked in calm, letting the silence do the work of announcing something serious was coming. He set Frank Ortiz's paperwork down on the table, and loud enough for the whole diner to hear, laid out the entire story, the invented debt, the document with no record, the 2 other widows swindled the same way in years past. Richard went pale first, then red with contained fury. He tried to protest that this was slander from an outsider meddling in business that wasn't his, but Sheriff Briggs stepped in, hat still dusty from that morning's ride, and confirmed every detail with his own authority, saying in a tone that allowed no argument that he'd be taking this straight to the district attorney and the county judge, if that's what it took, and that he'd be making sure the whole town knew name by name and date by date exactly how many widows Richard Halloway had swindled. The men at the table, his 2 rancher friends included, looked at each other in silence because nobody expected to watch the richest and most feared man in the county fall apart in public, in front of his own friends. One of the 2 friends, uncomfortable, stood up mid-sentence, muttered an excuse and walked out without finishing his coffee, not wanting to be seen anywhere near what was about to happen. Richard, realizing there was no way out with any shred of honor left, and worse, no way out in front of his own friends, agreed in a rasping voice to legally sell the land back to Sarah at a fair price and to sign away any future claim on her or her children in exchange for Jack not taking it further to the district attorney. 2 hours later, at the county courthouse, with Frank Ortiz notarizing and Sheriff Briggs as witness, the signatures went through. The money changed hands, the release was filed, and for the first time in her life, Sarah, who'd ridden in on Carol's borrowed truck the second she heard what happened that morning, held in her hands a document stating, with the full weight of the law behind it, that the land, Spring included, belonged to her and her children with no debt anybody could ever invent again. When Jack handed her the deed that same afternoon, no ceremony, just folding the paper into her hand like someone passing over a key, Sarah read her own name slowly, read her children's names, and understood that her life had just found solid ground nobody was ever going to be able to take away again. She looked up at Jack, who stood waiting quietly with his cap in his hands, and gave him, in a low but clear voice, the answer he'd asked for that same morning. She told him yes, that she'd marry him, not for protection, because the protection was already signed and in her hand, but because she wanted to. The wedding happened 2 months later at the small Cedar Creek Community Chapel in a simple ceremony. It felt like the whole town showed up that morning, curious to see with their own eyes the ending of a story that had traveled through every house in the form of gossip and was now closing in the most honest way possible, in front of everybody. Carol Jennings stood as matron of honor, proud as if she were marrying off a daughter of her own. Frank Ortiz, invited by Jack out of gratitude for his help, drove in wearing a suit he rarely pulled out of the closet. Sarah wore a pale blue dress she'd sewn herself over the previous weeks, her grandmother's rosary wound between her fingers, wanting a piece of her family there with her too. The twins, almost 2 now, stayed in Carol's arms through the ceremony, Wyatt watching everything with serious curiosity, and Lucy trying to grab the flowers off the altar, until Carol had to distract her with an embroidered handkerchief. When the officiant, voice a little thick with emotion he didn't bother hiding, pronounced them married, Jack leaned down and kissed Sarah on the forehead, a simple gesture that carried more truth than any promise shouted out loud. Outside the chapel, even Miss Peggy showed up with a bunch of wildflowers and a silent apology for the gossip months earlier, handing them to Sarah with a murmur that she hoped she'd be very happy. Sarah, who no longer had room in her chest for old grudges, thanked her with a genuine smile because she understood that in a small town, even gossip is, in its own crooked way, just people's way of never losing sight of each other. The Bennett Ranch, which had spent 7 years waiting without knowing it for the people who'd finally fill it, filled up at last with the sound of a family. Sarah walked into that house with the twins in her arms, looked at the wide rooms, the long front porch, the green pasture stretching out toward the ridge, and had to stop in the doorway because her legs went weak with emotion. Jack put his hand gently at her waist and told her all of it was hers now too, and that she didn't need to rush to feel at home. The twins grew up fast, well-fed and well-loved. Wyatt was the first to call Jack Dad, at 11 months old, one Sunday morning, reaching his clumsy little arms toward him from his crib. Jack had to sit down in the rocking chair because his legs wouldn't hold him from the emotion. Lucy, more watchful, waited months longer, but when she finally said it, it was tugging on his pant leg in the middle of the kitchen, demanding to be picked up. And Jack, who'd spent 7 years believing nobody would ever call him that again, discovered that the heaviest words in life often come in 2 syllables from a small child. 3 years after the wedding, Sarah gave birth to a 3rd child, a boy they named Walter, in honor of the sheriff who'd stood by them that morning. The labor was long, but Carol was there start to finish, and it all turned out fine at the end of a night that kept the whole house up, Jack pacing the hallway back and forth until the newborn's first cry cut through the dawn like a promise kept. The years on the Bennett Ranch rolled on, marked by calving seasons, spring rains, and the county fair every fall. Wyatt grew up with a natural hand for cattle, the same stubborn patience Jack remembered in Daniel back when he worked the herds, and by 15 he was running a small roundup on his own, no correction needed. Lucy, on the other hand, inherited her mother's steady gaze that never dropped for anybody, and grew up with a real talent for numbers, keeping the ranch's books herself from a young age in a ledger Jack kept with more pride than he'd ever admit out loud. Walter, the youngest, turned out most like Jack in temperament, quiet and watchful, with a habit of staring off at the horizon whenever something weighed on him, a gesture Sarah recognized instantly and that reminded her fondly of those first afternoons a stranger had stopped in front of her house asking for water. He didn't really need. None of the 3 kids ever forgot where they came from. Sarah made sure to tell them, calmly and without drama, the story of Daniel, their biological father, the man who gave his life trying to save a helpless calf in a flooded ravine, and told them, too, how Jack had come into their lives one October afternoon asking for water. He needed a lot less than he needed a reason to stay a little longer. The children grew up knowing they were loved by choice, not just by blood, and that, in time, made them steadier than most other kids in the county. As for Richard Halloway, fate followed the exact road he'd spent years paving for himself. After that morning at the diner, his name started rotting slowly in the mouth of the whole county. The other widows he'd swindled came forward once they heard Sarah's story, and with the district attorney's help, managed to recover at least part of what had been taken from them. The rancher friends who used to respect him out of fear started avoiding his table at the livestock auctions. Wade Briggs left the company before the year was out, seeing which way the wind was blowing and not wanting his own name dragged down with it. One of the widows who'd lost her land years earlier and moved to the city to live with her sister came back to town eventually, her own children grown, once the county judge managed to get part of her land returned to her. She planted a young oak on that recovered stretch of ground, saying she wanted something alive to grow out of all that lost time. And that story, passed mouth to mouth, finished sealing in Cedar Creek the reputation Richard Halloway had spent 20 hard years building. Preston Halloway, ashamed of the role his uncle had tried to push him into without even fully consulting him, distanced himself from the family business and ended up settling down on his own in another town, far from his uncle's shadow. Richard grew more and more alone in his big empty house, drinking away long nights, and died a few years later of what the town called a heart condition, though Carol, when she heard, said quietly that it was really a conscience condition, because a man who sows cruelty ends up harvesting it from the inside. Only 3 people showed up to his funeral, and not one of them shed a tear. The company got split up among distant relatives who barely knew the land at all. And the spring Richard had coveted so badly kept right on flowing, indifferent to the greed and the cruelty of men, exactly where it had always been, feeding, without any more obstacles, the land that belonged to Sarah and her children. One Sunday afternoon many years later, Jack, grey now at the temples, and Sarah, with the first fine lines around her eyes, sat on the porch of the Bennett Ranch drinking coffee, the way they did every evening as the sun went down. The twins, grown now, helped Jack with the ranch work, and little Walter chased a stubborn hen around the yard that refused to be caught. Sarah rested her head on her husband's shoulder and told him quietly that sometimes she still thought about that morning. She heard an unfamiliar engine coming up the road and figured it was just one more problem showing up. Jack laughed softly, squeezed her hand, and told her he'd thought the exact same thing the first time he saw the leaky roof on that old farmhouse. They sat in silence a long while, watching the sun sink behind the ridge, painting the sky orange and pink, each of them grateful, in their own way, without needing to say it out loud, that they'd chosen the road that once looked wrong, but had led them exactly where they were always supposed to be. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with somebody who needs to be reminded that anything is possible, that it's never too late for a second chance. Subscribe to Second Chance Tales and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. And now tell us down in the comments which moment in this story hit you the hardest, because we read every single comment, and you have no idea how much that keeps us going to bring you more stories like this one. And to you watching all the way to the end, thank you for sticking with us. See you in the next story.